There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'" What is God like? Isn't that the real question that divides all the major religions of the world? I'm not talking about denominational differences within Christianity. We tend to argue over what does God like rather than what is God like. And we argue about what He likes. Does He like instrumental music or non-instrumental? Does He like baptism by sprinkling or immersion? Does He like hymns or praise courses? And we could go on and on about the things that we argue about what God likes. But the question that we're really asking today is that question that divides religions from each other. What is God like? Radical Islam teaches that God is very harsh towards those who don't know Him by His name as Allah, that He hates those that would be considered infidels, calls for His followers to murder those who haven't understood what they believe to be truth about Him. It teaches that He is the kind of God who doesn't mind if His own followers die as long as they do it while killing people who do not follow Him. Deism sees a completely different picture of God. By all means, He exists. He created the universe and everything that's in it, but from there, He's taken a hands-off approach. He doesn't have anything to do with the world. It's like winding up a watch and observing as it runs down. But the watchmaker completely is removed from His creation. God's just watching the world turn around and run the course. He doesn't answer prayer. He doesn't intervene. He doesn't really care how it goes. He's an impersonal observer and nothing else. Hinduism teaches not just one God, but many gods. Some are mean, some are kind, some will intervene in your life, some can't be bothered. They're watching you live this life so they can reward or punish you, and next time they'll reincarnate you from the wheel of karma. Christianity teaches that God came to earth as Jesus. And when we needed to know what God is like, He told us. Though He is mysterious, He's no mystery. He's exalted and holy, yet He's right beside us. Even though He is all powerful, He cares for us in our weakness. It can be confusing sometimes. So Jesus told us what God was like by telling this story. There's three characters in this story, and we're going to look at each one. The first is the younger son. He's usually referred to as the prodigal son because he wandered away from home. And really, if you were going to describe him, you might say he's just a brat. He's one of those kids that has to have his own way regardless of how it affects everyone else. He goes to the father and says, I want a part of your estate that legally will belong to me when you die. I don't want to wait until then. I want you to give it to me now. Think about it. What this kid's literally saying is, I can't wait for you to die. I'd rather have your stuff now than have you. According to the law of the inheritance in that day, because he was the younger son, that equaled out that he got about a third of the father's assets. The older son received 2 times as much as all the rest. So since there's just 2 of them, that meant a third for the younger and 2/3 for the older. Wealth in that day was really not about what we think about wealth today. It wasn't a bank account and investment portfolios. It was about tangible belongings, property. It was land, animals, farming utensils, clothes. In order to take them with him, they would have had to have liquidated some of these assets. Somehow or another, in ancient Middle East, they would have what we would consider to be a neighborhood yard sale or auction. Imagine how the father felt watching them sell off what he had worked so hard to accumulate. Imagine what the neighbors felt about the son who is shaming his father. And then with everything that they could haggle for a price had been gone, he goes into a far-off land, puts as much distance as he can between himself and his father. Now, the reason Jesus went into so much detail about this kid is he wants everyone to see themselves in this prodigal son. You may not recognize yourself in this picture, but when we sin, we're acting exactly like this younger son. God's blessed us with so much. He's given us this world that we can live in. He's provided for our needs. And sin is the rebellion against Him, saying, thank you for all the stuff that you do for me. Thank you for all the stuff that you've given me. But as for being my father, I'd rather just go on my own. I'm not going to live according to your standards. I'm not going to let you be my God. Paul describes this part of our life in Colossians, the 1st chapter, in the 21st verse. He says, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. Now, for many of us, we'll say, that's not a realistic picture of me. I'm not like that kid. I'm not that selfish. I'm not that uncaring. But God says when we sin, we're wandering. We're a prodigal. And that's how we are like the prodigal son. In this case, the wandering had turned ugly even in our eyesight. He wanted everything he could get for himself. Jesus said it didn't take long before he lost all that the Father had given him. You catch those phrases in this passage? He says he squandered his wealth. He spent everything. He began to be in need. You know, funny, all that coincided with the famine that was hitting the whole land. It's funny how one disaster always seems to follow another. He went broke and all of a sudden the whole country is hungry. Maybe it's caused by a crop failure or economic downturn, or maybe because they failed to pass the king's $4.7 trillion jobs bill. Who knows? But the only job available to this boy is slopping hogs. He has no experience because his father was wealthy. He had servants that took care of everything. And so Jesus said he hired himself out to be a pig farmer. The word here means glued. That he glued himself to this job of being a pig farmer. Now, I've got some experience in being a pig farmer, and there's aspects of it that I look back and say, hey, that was a good life growing up on a pig farm. But there's other things about it that's not so great, specifically the smell. For the original hearers of Jesus' story, they would have automatically understood that this was way more than just being around a bunch of smelly pigs. You see, automatically they understood this boy was Jewish, and this made a big difference for him than it does for you and me. No animal in the world was more unclean or nasty to a Jewish person than a pig. The law of Moses said, don't even touch one if it's dead. Here he is living among unclean Gentiles, and now he's glued himself to a pig pen. You know, pigs eat every day, so he can't keep the Sabbath. He can't keep any of the commandments about remaining unclean or clean. And now he's basically gotten as low as anyone in the Jewish world could get. But then it gets even lower. He's so hungry that the pig slop starts looking good to him. It says he longed to eat it, but no one was willing to waste it on him. Think about it. The owner of the pigs is willing to feed slop to the pigs, but not to this kid. The pigs are valuable to the owner, but not this prodigal son. He's lower than a pig now. And Jesus describes here, then he comes to his senses. He comes to his senses. He wanted riches and he got them. He wanted new surroundings and he got them. He wanted food, but he was denied. And now he just wants to go home. It was better there. And it would be again if he could just go home and maybe as a servant. He can't be a son any longer, but maybe he can be one of his father's hired hands. He probably thought, my dad's a better boss than this guy is. And so you can imagine the prodigal son going home. He has this speech planned. I'm so sorry. I can't return everything I took, but just make me a servant. I'll spend the rest of my life paying for what I did. You know, one of the things we see in this story is that sin's never as glamorous as it seems, and it always hurts more than it's advertised. The second character in this story is the father. The story's called The Prodigal Son, but really the story's about the father. It begins with that introduction. A certain man had 2 sons. He has more to say about the father than either of the boys. And the father watched. Perhaps the hardest part of this story is understanding is that the father gave the son what he wanted, even though he knew it was going to be bad for him. Even though he knew it was a bad thing. He didn't refuse the son. He could have. In fact, he had legal recourse. Deuteronomy 21:18 says, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders of the gate of his town. They shall say to the elders, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a profligate and a drunkard. Then all the men of his town shall stone him to death. You must purge the evil from among you. All Israel will hear of it and be afraid. Man, that's kind of a scary thing, isn't it? See, some of you parents are probably nodding in agreement. It's a good plan. You can imagine if that was the case, our kids might be really good. Now, in our culture, in our world, nobody's espousing that. In fact, we would say that's harsh, and that's the point. It was harsh. It was harsh. It was within his realm to do that, but he didn't do that. He didn't force his son to stay. He didn't refuse him. He just watched his son sell off what it had taken years for him to accumulate. He watched him arrogantly ride off like a millionaire on a ticket that he had spent his whole life paying for. He watched him leave, and it must have broken his heart. That's not the only thing he watched. Every day he watched the road. He watched the road to see if there was anyone coming a long way off. He watched the road to see if his son might be returning. His father didn't follow him. He didn't force him to stay. He just watched. He waited and wept. And then finally the son does return. And when he does, the father welcomes him. The father sees the son coming down the road and he runs to him. That was something that wasn't done by men in the ancient world. They didn't run, and they most especially didn't run to their son. Their son would have come to them. But when he gets there, the boy immediately goes into the speech about how he had sinned against heaven and has sinned against his dad. But that's as far as he got. he never gets to the line about from now on he's not a son, but he would like to be a servant. The part about how he was going to find a way to earn his way back in, the part where that he was going to pay his father back, but instead the father doesn't let him. He lets him confess his sin, but that's where he stops him, because the father already has a plan for him. The father already has a plan for his son. It's called mercy, forgiveness. And he will have nothing less than full restoration. He throws his arms around his son, and maybe the boy even still smelled like pigs. He's still covered in dirt, but it didn't matter. His boy was home. That's the only thing that mattered to him. He calls for a robe and sandals and a ring, all that was needed that showed that this was his son. And the father finished with a feast, and he plans a party. He orders his servants to kill the fattened calf. Now, this isn't a slightly overweight sheep or plump goat or a big boned chicken. No, this is the calf that's been fed and been kept in a special pen to gain weight for a special occasion. And this is that occasion, because it needs to be enough for the whole town. See, for this celebration, he's going to invite all of his friends and family and neighbors. These are the same people that looked at this son probably and said, "What's wrong with you? Why are you treating your father this way?" And here the father wants everyone to celebrate the return of his son. His son was dead to him, separated. That's what death is separation. And now he's come back. He's alive to him again. That separation is ended. He's been reconciled. They're together again. See, if Jesus had been talking about an Islamic God, then the father would have beheaded the infidel child in the honor killing. If it was a deist child, then the father would have never noticed he was gone in the first place, or it wouldn't have mattered. If he was a Hindu god, then the father would have figured that whatever the son had suffered was only karma. Better luck next time you're born. But the God that Jesus is describing is like this father. He runs to those who run away from him. Ephesians 2:4 says, "But because of His great love for us, God, who in His rich mercy made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions, it is by grace you have been saved." I always thought that the word prodigal meant someone who had left and returned. But that's not what it means. It means one who is reckless, one who is extravagantly wasteful. That's what this father's love is like. Over the top, willing to be wasted. Maybe it's the prodigal father instead of the prodigal son, because he was willing to extravagantly go over the top for his child. And now we get to the older son. The Bible has something to say about the older son here. And basically, the thing it says is that he whined. In order to understand the story, we really have to go back to the first two verses of Luke 15. In those first two verses, it says the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him, talking about Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." See, there were sinners who realized their lives were not what they had hoped they would be. And they understood that Jesus had the answers, and they were coming to him in droves. And he accepted them. But the religious people didn't like it. They couldn't stand it. They were saying, "We've spent our whole lives trying to keep the rules and be good boys and girls, while these sinners have ignored you and ignored the law, but you accept them just like you accept us. We deserve preferential treatment. Why should you love lost people when perfectly good found people are going unnoticed?" That's why Jesus adds in the older brother in this story, because he had the same attitude. The older brother says, "You know your son wasted your money. Now you're throwing a party for him. You never did anything like this for me. It's not fair." And so he refused to go into the party. He withdrew himself from his younger brother, who he thought was a worse sinner than he was. And so what does the father do? He goes out to get him. He says, "My son who is dead is now alive." My son who was lost is now found. And the story ends without telling us what the older brother did. I always wondered, what did he do? Why did Jesus end the story this way? Maybe one of the reasons is because he wants us to end the story ourselves by deciding what we are going to do. What's your reaction when someone you think deserves less than you seems to get more? When grace is amazing for someone other than you? Both of these kids in this story were out in the cold, so to speak, for a time. One because of sin and the other because he didn't realize his own sin and unworthiness. And maybe you're like one of these kids, one of the sons, that something's keeping you out of the party. You know, we have a party here at church every week. We come to celebrate God's love for us. And if you can't find any other reason to come, here's one for you. People who attend church tend to live 7 years longer. Come back next week and you'll probably buy at least a couple extra days. Seriously, maybe you've been gone from home for a while. Maybe you've been on a far-off land and you're starting to realize it would be better off to go back home. They're having a party there. And maybe the hypocrites are keeping you out. Maybe you're too busy. Maybe you don't think you're worthy. Maybe you're still trying to talk God into letting you be a servant. God's calling you. I love the story about the New York City homeless lady who went to the Bible studies at the homeless shelter. And one day at one of those meetings, she went forward at the invitation. And when the preacher asked her, "Edith, why did you come forward today?" she quoted him verse 2 of Luke 15, where it says, "Jesus welcomes sinners and eateth with them too." Now she misunderstood that eateth was that he ate with them, but she thought that he was saying, and Edith can come, her name, that Edith can come to him too. And she said, "You know what? He accepts even me." And you know what the truth is? Jesus welcomes sinners and Matt with them too. Jesus welcomes sinners and John and Mary and Joe and Paul and Bill and Sue and whoever it might be, whatever your name is, he welcomes you too. And so what about today? Will you come to him? He's standing waiting for you to come to him. He's looking down the road to see if you'll turn away from the squalor that you've been living in. If you'll turn away from your self-righteousness and come back to him. Maybe you're the young son that you've been living in sin and you realize, wait a minute, I need to turn my life around. Today's that opportunity to do that. Today's the day to repent, confess, be baptized. If you have that decision to make, call me. If you're watching this, I would love to talk to you about that and make arrangements for that to happen. Maybe you're like the older brother and you've gone to church your whole life and you're pretty self-righteous. You're a pretty good guy and you don't need to go out and talk to these other people because you're good. Jesus was talking to you as well. And basically he's saying you're not as good as you thought you are. In fact, you're out in the cold too because you haven't really given everything to him. If you have a decision to make, today's the day to do it. I look forward to hearing from you. Until next week, you take care. Stay safe. I love you.